All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this tutorial of this tuxedo cat. This is a commission and I'm going to try to keep it as loose as I can and have a lot of fun with it. So anyway, I do recommend you watch, if you're a super beginner especially, I actually do recommend that you watch more of this video before trying it on your own. There is a little gear in the bottom right corner where you can put this on fast forward or you can slow it down. So if I'm going too fast or too slow, you can change the speed of this video. Okay, I've been editing this video and it's making me realize I need to do like a kind of in-depth why I did that discussion before we get started. And just know that as you move through this video tutorial, I'm going to repeat some parts of the painting with the video footage by replaying it and re-showing it, and also re-showing some of the mixing of the paint color because I didn't get good footage of that. There's going to be a lot of extra demonstrations in this painting, and if you feel like you're having to pause too much or whatever, I kind of designed this tutorial so that for example, I get this area wet and the eyes wet, and then I discuss something and demonstrate something else. And you might be like, oh, I need to keep going. But no, it's okay to let your painting dry just a little bit in between things that you do to it to get the paint to react the way you want it to. Because if you do some things in watercolor on too wet a paper or too wet a paint, you'll lose control of your painting. So just know you have time. As long as your painting does not completely dry, you have time, and you'll see what I mean when you get through this tutorial. But I do recommend you just watch this all the way through. This first session is probably about a half hour after I do this discussion, but right now the video is at about 20 minutes. But anyway, I wanted to talk about why painters, even more experienced ones like myself, honestly, I still do sometimes get hung up on how to paint white fur and black fur. And it's because white fur and black fur trick us. They make us think that black fur should be super black, dark all the time, and white fur is always white and super white. And then shadows are just a little bit dark. But sometimes dark shadows, the dark shadows in the white will actually be lighter in value than some of the lighter areas of a sun-kissed area of black fur. Like if sun was hitting this cat really strong, this black fur might shine like a super light yellow, and that's how you would paint it, even though it's black fur. And so the values can be tricky and confusing. So how do you get around that? What you do is make sure, one, you're using a really good reference. You want to just make sure that your values hang together, and you want your darkest darks and your lightest lights in the area of interest. So super black, there's some super black in here, super black around this eye, super white here. But then, like as we move away from the center of interest, things get lighter. So this is more purple, black. This is a light black, not a complete black in here. And this ear is kind of back, so I made it lighter. So just notice that and how I did that, and that will hopefully help you be more successful in painting black and or white animals. All right, let's go to the next stage of this video. All right, I've got my Hand Mule The Collection cold press. It's Hand Mule The Collection cold press, and I'm about to start a tutorial, or actually a painting. It's a commission of a tuxedo cat. And so I am also trying a new mic. So y'all will have to let me know what you think of my new mic. But I'm gonna take this off the block. One block that I received from Bao came with this little tool. It's like a dull knife that you can use, but a table knife would also work. And there's always a little slit that you can, I can't say that with a straight face, but you just insert this and tear. And here is the image, and it's obviously too big to go this way, so we'll have to put it this way. And I think now that I see, I'm going to use this full sheet. So what I do is pretend this is a window. I put that up against the window, put this like that, and then I can trace it. And I use a number 2 pencil, just any cheap pencil. Softer pencils will make a mess when you get them wet. They'll make kind of pencil mud on your painting. So you do want to use a harder pencil. And just know, after you put your pencil line down, usually you do want to lighten it at least a little bit with a kneaded eraser like this, because you don't want your pencil lines, you might not want your pencil lines so dark. And just know that after you get your pencil lines wet when you're painting, it sets them. And the only way to get rid of them at that point is if you're using good paper like Arches cold press paper, and you can use a stiff scrubber or a stiff oil painting brush to scrub your pencil lines out that you might still be able to see. But if you're using like a hot press or a cheaper cold press, you may or may not be able to scrub out your pencil lines later. So do lighten your pencil lines with kneaded eraser. And kneaded eraser is just, it's a soft eraser that you can knead like this, and you can knead it so that you get a clean spot, and then it's softer than most erasers, so it won't damage your paper when you erase. But when you erase, you'll do it lightly anyway, so it's usually not a problem. All right, I'm gonna go transfer. We professional artists call this transferring, when we trace our line drawing onto our watercolor paper. You don't want to draw on your watercolor paper, because usually what the process of actually drawing in the classic sense means, you draw, you make a mistake, you erase, and you end up having to erase a lot, and that damages the watercolor paper. So even if you want to hand draw your image, you still want to hand draw it on another piece of paper and then transfer it, similar to what I'm going to do with my tracing that I did in Photoshop. You still want to transfer it that way to your watercolor paper. You do not want to do the actual work of drawing on watercolor paper, because if you have to erase a lot, it will just damage your paper. I'm painting it on Hahnemühle cold press, and this is about 11 by 14, but this is probably 16 inches. In fact, it's roughly 14 by 19 inches, this piece of paper. So I'm definitely painting larger, and I'm playing with that idea of painting larger to see if I can get more dramatic results. And so this is cold press. This is much easier to paint on than hot press because it blends so much easier. In fact, sometimes it feels like it's blending itself even when maybe you don't want it to. And I'm gonna tape it down to my backing board, which is just lightweight backing board that framers use, or those boards you see in yards when there's a political campaign. Any lightweight kind of material like that. You can even duct tape cardboard. I'm going to tape it down with my Nido tape. And so what this does is, one, it gives you a really pretty border, and two, watercolor paper buckles as you get it wet, unless you're using really thick, expensive, super expensive paper. And so I use 140 around. This does buckle when it gets wet, and so if you tape it down, as it dries, it'll dry back mostly flat, not perfectly flat, and that is okay. Framers are used to dealing with that. They can manage it when they go to frame a piece, if it ever gets that far. And so you just want to make sure you burnish down your edges so that the water won't seep under it. Again, this Holbein soft tape I get on Dick Blick. You can find my supplies through my Patreon link on my Patreon index, or you can find it on rachelstudio.com/supply list. You can also find my supplies link there. They are affiliate links. I do get a little bit of money when you use my links, so I always appreciate that. All right, this boy is named Sam, and I will probably use masking for his whiskers. Let's take a look at my reference. Yeah, Sam's gonna need some masking on his whiskers. We don't want to lose those. All right, so I've got a rigger. This is an old rigger that I've had for a long time, and I'm going to use this to put on the masking for the whiskers. In watercolor, the white of your paper is the white. So if we want white whiskers, it's almost impossible to paint around every individual whisker. So what you do instead is you put down masking to mask out the whiskers, and this is masking. It's by Winsor & Newton. It's removable. It's like a liquid plastic you paint on, and then when it dries, it protects the white paper, and you can paint over it as much as you want. And then at the end of the painting process, you peel it up, and then it leaves the white of the paper, which is perfect for whiskers. Another thing I like to do at the very beginning of the painting process is to erase any hard or dark lines that you think might show. Since this is a dark cat, we can paint over most of these dark lines. Doesn't hurt to mask out a few. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to get this wet, and then I'm gonna scrub it on soap. The soap protects this paintbrush from getting masking dried in the bristles, which will ruin your brush. So that's why you put soap on. And now I'm gonna remove this. I'm gonna remove the top, smell it. It still smells like ammonia, so that means it's still good. Masking does go bad. I did just buy a new thing of masking, but I just pour it out into a little container so that not too much air gets to my fresh masking. I assume that's not good for it. And then I've chiseled my brush into a flatter shape so I can use it to paint with thin whiskers. And I've dipped my brush in the masking, and now there's a big blob of masking on my brush. So what I often do is I'll paint a few strokes on the side just to get the excess off, so I don't get a blob coming out of my brush when I touch the masking. And I'm using a really light touch here. And another thing that you want to do is usually move your paper to an angle where you can easily have a nice arc of motion for your wrist when you're painting these. Also, if you get a break in the line, that often looks good actually. I'm letting that there be a break in the line. And this does take muscle memory. Your first few tries, your masking will probably look too thick to you. That's pretty common. Just like anything in watercolor painting, you have to keep practicing and being patient with yourself. I know, easier said than done. And we do tend to be impatient and want everything right away, but a lot of things that seem simple in watercolor can take some practice. So don't be too hard on yourself. I'm just putting a couple little glints in the eyes as well. And then there's these really cool arcs of whiskers here. All right, that's probably good. For as little as the parts of masking that we put on, it probably won't take more than 5 minutes to let this dry, so we'll let this dry and then we can paint. For the next 20 minutes, I created extra footage demonstrating how to mix water with the paint to get the correct paint to water ratio for the desired darkness when painted on the paper. My mixing went a little bit off camera, so I wanted to make extra footage of me mixing so you guys could see more clearly what I was doing as far as mixing is concerned. For those of you who are super beginners, the more water you add to your paint, the lighter it will dry. You'll hear me say tea consistency, milk, and cream consistency, and what I'm referring to is how much water I've added to the paint. Tea consistency paint has the most water added and results in the lightest colors. And you'll see me tilt the palette and the water runs or almost runs. And then Milk consistency has less water added, but it's still pretty watery. So when you tilt your palette up, it doesn't happen perfectly every time, but for the most part, it will bead and maybe drip a little bit. And then cream consistency paint just has a tiny bit of water. It does need a little bit of water added, but when you tilt your palette up, it won't run at all. And when you paint with cream consistency paint, it results in dark, rich colors. All right, so my masking is dry. It's been a minute. And so I'm going to start with the basic things that I know I need to get in, which one is I want to put in Winsor Green Gold underpainting for the eyes. And this Winsor Green Gold is very yellow. Despite it being called green gold, it really makes a great basic yellow. So I'm going to just paint that in. And because I've masked out the glints, I don't need to paint around it. And then I'm gonna get some water for some super lights. And then I'm going to take my brush and squeeze it out and then lift out a highlight there. All right, so while those eyes are still wet, I'm going to get some permanent green light paint about milk consistency, and I'm going to drop it in the eye. And you've got plenty of time to do this. And then I'm going to get some permanent green light and drop in a little bit of green in this cat's eyes. And then I'm going to squeeze that out, clean out my brush, and then I'm going to get some fairly thick burnt sienna. By the way, just for your information, I usually don't work with paint straight from the tube like this, but I'd run out on my palette, so I squeezed out some burnt sienna on my palette. Also, with my alla prima style of painting I'm doing with my butterflies and looser painting, I've been painting with fresh from the tube paint more, but for this kind of painting that is more about painting in layers with more watery paint, I usually like to use paint squeezed from the tube and then dried on the palette and then just reactivate what I need. But here I'm getting cream consistency burnt sienna and I'm adding a little bit of water and then working it around on my palette to get the glops out. So you do need to kind of work the color into your brush bristles and make sure there's no glops when you use cream consistency paint. And then I'm going to get some fairly thick burnt sienna cream consistency to add a little bit of darks along the top and the edges. And so I do this just to add some interest. All right, so what you're gonna see me do next is an underpainting for this kitty. And what you do when you paint in this style that's a little less loose than my butterflies, which is very alla prima style, I work in several layers. So we're gonna put a layer of underpainting that's gonna be very colorful. And then on top of that, we'll put some more colors. And then on top of that, we'll put some black. We'll also build up the fur textures by layering fur texture over fur texture over fur texture to make it look more furry. So the underpainting I'm about to do is kind of like laying the groundwork for your whole painting. I decided to do a very colorful underpainting because I wanted to make this look a little bit more artistic. And this blue underpainting will shine up through the black fur that we paint later and peek through the layers. And you'll see what I mean as we progress. All right, so next I'm gonna paint a blue underpainting around the eyes, and you're gonna see me paint that blue right up to the eyes, literally touching the blue to the green eyes. Now, if you're more of a beginner, you might wanna let your eyes completely dry so you don't get any bleeding. You might not know how to handle it. You're gonna see me paint this blue around the eyes, and then it starts invading the eye, and you'll see me brush the blue color away from the eye and see how it changed the direction of the bleed. So I just had to get that watery paint kind of
pushed away from the eye and then it stopped bleeding in. And I just did that instinctively. And every time I do it, it would react differently. If I painted these eyes the same way, it might bleed more, it might be less controllable. That's part of how watercolor works. I personally think it makes things look dreamier when you let things bleed together. But I have 20 years experience, so I do know instinctively a little bit probably how to control it a little bit better. So if you're more of a beginner and you don't want to have that bleed or it scares you, maybe 1, you can practice on a piece of paper. 2, also watch what I do. 3, you can just let your eye dry instead of painting it the wet blue paint right into the wet eye paint. So you choose what direction you want to do. If you want to get experimental, kudos to you. I always encourage experiments. All right, now I'm just mixing up more tea consistency blue. I'm going to go off camera a little bit next here, but don't worry, I will show you what I'm doing. Luckily I realized it and then I changed the camera angle so you could see what I was doing, and I re-demonstrated it for you. But here, see how drippy that is? That's what tea consistency paint does, and it's the perfect amount of color to water ratio for an underpainting. And while this is all wet, I'm going to paint in and let it all kind of bleed together a little bit. I don't mind if I leave a little bit of highlight here and there, and I don't mind if I get a little bleeding here and there. I'm getting a lot of bleeding though, aren't I? So that might not be good, but we will see. And then this is shadowed white. There's a lot of shadows through here. So on all this is black, right? You can fur out the edge even by going like that. And to add interest, I'm going to put some purple here and there. Especially here. And then the sun is really hitting his eye here. I'm going to get a smaller, cleaner brush and get some red. I would say about tea consistency, watery tea. And I'm going to put in that's that. I'm going to make sure I get it in the right spot here. And then this is all really light because of the light's hitting it. I'm going to put in a little hints of red up through here. And then I'm going to get some watery, just real watery Windsor Green Gold, and again, use it to push and make sure my colors stay pretty clean Windsor Green Gold. So I'm putting a puddle in this now buckling area so it will make sure that stays clean color. And then I'm going to switch back to my larger brush and continue on with my journey of painting these shadows through here. And I'm going to leave some flashes of white fur, and then I'm going to paint some pretty strong shadows too. Okay, so I didn't get that on camera. Let me just move that down. What I'm doing is I put some really tea consistency brush strokes of fur, tea consistency here and there, and then I'm going to go in with some purple tea consistency. Got to be careful with this Windsor purple because it gets so strong so fast. And I'm going to put a little bit of that
here and there. You can use the side of your brush in a very fast motion to suggest a fur effect too. It's really pretty. And some stronger blues up in here. Some really strong blues in this area. And then of course, there's going to be black fur through here eventually. And then I'm going to get, while this is still wet, I'm going to get some watery red. I'm going to work it into my brush, get about milk consistency. And okay, so that's pretty strong. So now I'm going to dip my brush in the water, shake it out, and then just blend that so that I have a kind of a red underpainting for the ear. And maybe put a bit of a stronger bit of red